Welcome to the series of Relational Database Management System. Myself is Fatima Rafiq, Assistant Professor, Abedanamda Senior College, BCA Department. Today we will be starting with the next chapter, that is chapter number 3, Transaction Management. We will be covering these following topics in this particular series: transaction management, transaction properties, transaction state, concurrent execution, and serializability. So without wasting time, let's start with the unit number 3. Now, what is transaction? Whenever we consider a transaction is a program unit whose execution may or may not change the content of databases. We know that whenever we do any transaction, this transaction is actually happening by using some programs, and it directly affects the databases. So the transaction which we are running is what? It is nothing but a program unit whose execution may or may not change the content of database. If the transaction is actually executed and it is a transaction which is not a read-only transaction, it is doing some or updating some values, at that time the database has to be changed. The content of database is getting changed. But if the transaction which we are talking about is just a read-only transaction, so at that time the database content will never change. Like for example, you consider the bank example. In a bank, if I am just checking my balance, so I am performing one transaction, but just checking a balance will not change the database state. So the database will remain same. But if I do a transaction like update, I have withdraw or deposits amount, at that time the amount of data, the amount of money which in present in my bank may change, depend on the number of depend on the operation which I have did. So that's why we say that it may or may not change the state of the database. There are some facts which are there which we need to understand by whenever we read the transactions. A transaction is a program unit whose execution may not change the content of the database. The transaction is executed as a single unit. Like if we consider any transaction, the transaction, if it consider the 100 set of instruction, but logically we take these 100 lines as only a single unit. If the database operation do not update the database but only retrieve the data, this type of transaction is called read-only transaction. As I said that if I am checking only my balance, so at that time I am just taking or retrieving the data, but I am not changing it. So this is a kind of read-only transaction. A successful transaction can change the database from consistent state to another. If you are performing and the transaction is successfully completed, so what has to have? It has to be a consistent state from one transaction to the another transaction. Database management system transaction must be atomic, consistent, isolated, and durable. These are the asset properties that we will see in detail in the next lectures. If the database were in an inconsistent state before the transaction, it will remain inconsistent after the transaction. Like the transaction does not remove the inconsistency from the databases. If you have a database which have some errors or which have some wrong values in it, and if we perform the transaction, so the inconsistency of the database will remain same. Transaction execution does not remove the inconsistency from the databases. Like by using this, you can able to understand. See here, I have a transaction. The transaction begin from here and it end from here. If the database is consistent before the transaction execution, it has to be consistent after when the transaction is being completed. Database may temporarily be in the inconsistent state during the execution of the transaction. All the type of data access operations which are held between the beginning and the end of the transaction states are considered as a single logical transaction. Like you are using multiple reads, multiple writes. At that time, multiple reads and multiple writes can be happen but these multiple reads and multiple writes will be act as a single unit, single transaction. During the transaction, database is inconsistent. Only once the database is committed, the state is changed from one consistent state to another. So if the transaction, like for example, the transaction is getting started, before the transaction start, the database is consistent. Once the transaction is actually started its execution, there may be some time where the transaction is actually doing some inconsistency in the database. But once the transaction, when it is completed, the database has to be a consistent state. This is the most what we can say, most important quality of the transaction. The transaction should not should not change the state of database from the consistent state to inconsistent state. Database has to be a consistent state if the transaction is completed. This is all about the transactions and introduction to transactions, or what are transactions. Now, if you find any difficulty or any suggestion, or if you want any if you have any doubts, you can write in the comment box.